Hello, soulmates, and welcome back to Commander Abridged. This time around, we're having a Commander Legends special. Except for my commander, because this is not actually a Commander Legends special. But going first is Caps playing Hamza, Guardian of Araumi. Caps is looking to go wide, then go tall, playing lots of creatures that have counters to ramp out his other creatures and give them counters. Second is me playing Halana and Alena, partners. They're partners, but not partners. This deck is more of a hey, here's a neat synergy deck rather than an optimized one. I'm looking to use my commander to put counters onto creatures that care about removing counters from themselves, or that reference their own power in some way. Third is CJ playing Araumi of the Dead Tide. He calls this his Marinless Marin list. CJ plans on filling up his graveyard, then bringing back high quantities of dangerous bodies throughout the game for extra copies of powerful ETB or death triggers. Finally, there's James playing Kwain, Itinerant Meddler. This is a deck designed to draw a bunch of cards and do a little controlling while setting up some combos or reanimation. James's list also leans into some card draw matters synergies and life gain payoffs. With that out of the way, let's check out the game. Cap starts off with a Plains and passes to me. I play a Command Tower, tapping it for an Elvish Reclaimer and passing. CJ plays a Sunken Hollow, which enters tapped, and he passes the turn. James plays an Island and passes the turn. Cap starts turn 2 with a Forest, then casts a Rampant Growth, grabbing a Plains from his library, and he passes the turn. I play a Forest, then pass with my mana open. CJ plays a Dark Water Catacombs and plays a Millikin, setting up some self-mill to get those fatties in the graveyard. He passes the turn to James. James plays a Plains and casts Kwain, Itinerant Meddler from the command zone. With nothing else, he passes the turn. For turn 3, Cap starts off with a Forest, followed by a Genesis Hydra, where X is 2. It enters the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters, and Caps gets a trigger to reveal the top 2 cards of his library, casting any non-land permanent costing 2 mana or less. He whiffs, however, and passes the turn over to me as he shuffles his library. On his end step, I activate Elvish Reclaimer, sacrificing a Forest to grab a Raging Ravine from my library, which enters the battlefield tapped. I then untap and draw for my turn, starting with a Forest, following that up with a Rishkar Pima Renegade. When it enters, it triggers, and I put a +1/+1 counter on Rishkar and the Reclaimer. I then pass to CJ. CJ plays a Drowned Catacomb, entering untapped thanks to his Sunken Hollow, and he then casts a Notion Rain. He surveils 2, putting a basic island into the graveyard and keeping the other card on top, then draws 2 cards and takes 2 damage. With nothing else, he passes it over to James. James plays a Wasteland as his land for the turn, then casts an Ominous Seas. Now whenever he draws, he will put a Foreshadow counter on Ominous Seas, and when he reaches 8, he can make an 8/8 Kraken token. He passes with nothing else, keeping his boy Kwain on standby. To start turn 4, Caps plays a Forest, then taps out for a Steelbane Hydra, where X is 3 to have it enter with 3+1/+1 counters. He enters combat and swings the Genesis Hydra at CJ, who has no blocks and takes 2 damage. Caps passes the turn. I go to start my turn, but CJ has an upkeep action.
Yo, are you kidding me? Keyboard on the battle. Whoa!
Alright, I'll wait.
Holy
He
shit.
died, bro. Just fucking died.
I play a Stompy G
I'm just a
Shock
big
out of
fan
Stompy
That's
G.
pretty nice.
as my land for the turn, and cast Umezawa's Jite, which I equip to Rishkar after it resolves. I enter combat and swing Rishkar at James. In response to declaration of attacks, James activates Kwain, drawing 1 card and gaining 1 life, with the rest of the table opting to do the same. This triggers James's Ominous Seas, which gains 1 Foreshadow counter. James declares no blocks and takes 3 damage, causing Umezawa's Jite to trigger, putting 2 charge counters on it. I move to my end step, at which point CJ activates Millikin to mill 1 card and add a mana to his pool, but he mills a Lightning Greaves, which you hate to see, man. Then he starts his turn. CJ plays a Marsh Flats and cracks it right away, paying 1 life and gets a swamp from his library onto the battlefield. He then taps the Millikin, milling a Sower of Discord, and uses the colorless mana to activate the Dark Water Catacombs. He uses that mana to play a Dimir Signet, and follows this up by casting Araumi of the Dead Tide from the command zone. He ends his turn passing to James. James draws for the turn, triggering the Ominous Seas, getting another Foreshadow counter on it. He plays an untapped Glacial Fortress as his land for the turn, and follows that up with a Teferi's Ageless Insight. This doubles up all of his draws except for the first one in his draw step, further breaking the symmetry on Kwain's effect. With that set up, he passes the turn over to Caps to start turn 5. Caps plays a Plains, then heads right into combat, swinging the Steelbane Hydra at me. In response to attacks, I remove a charge counter from the Umezawa's Jite to give the Steelbane Hydra -1/-1 until the end of the turn. With the activated ability on the stack, Caps plays a Return to Nature, targeting the Jite, which I again respond to by removing the final charge counter in order to gain 2 life. Umezawa's Jite then gets destroyed, and I declare the Elvish Reclaimer as a blocker. Before damage, Caps activates the Steelbane Hydra, removing a +1/+1 counter from it, targeting Teferi's Ageless Insight to destroy it. James responds by activating Kwain, drawing 2 cards and gaining 1 life, which triggers the Ominous Seas twice, giving it 2 foreshadow counters, now a total of 4 on it. The rest of the table also draws 1 and gains 1 each from the Kwain activation. The Steelbane Hydra dies to combat damage, then Caps passes through his second main phase and passes the turn. I play a Forest and then cast a Froghemoth, entering combat right after and swinging it at CJ. In response, CJ casts a Pongify, targeting the frog.
Figured I was going monkey mode.
I pass through my second main phase and end my turn. CJ plays an island as his land for the turn and taps the Milliken, milling a Tribute Mage from his library and adding 1 colorless mana to his mana pool, which he uses to activate his Dimir Signet to play an Arcane Signet. He casts a Muldrifter for its evoke cost, both sacrificing it and drawing 2 cards when it enters the battlefield. He follows that up with a Stitcher's Supplier, milling 2 islands and a Careful Study when it enters the battlefield. For his final play of the turn, he Windmill Slams his keyboard and then passes. James untaps and draws for the turn, triggering the Ominous Seas for another foreshadow counter. He plays an island and follows CJ's example, casting an Arcane Signet, using it right away to play a face-up Apheto Alchemist. He passes the turn. Caps starts turn 6 with a Plains, then casts Karametra, God of Harvests. With nothing else, he passes it over to me. I untap, draw, then bring out Halana and Alena Partners from the command zone, followed by a Retreat to Kazandu, tapping Rishkar and Elvish Reclaimer for green mana to help cast it. I play a mountain, triggering Retreat to Kazandu, and I put a 1/1 counter on a Halana and Alena. I then enter combat, triggering Halana and Alena, and I give haste and put 3 1/1 counters on my Funky Monkey, but don't swing with it, opting to keep up blockers and pass the turn instead. On my end step, James casts a Path to Exile, targeting CJ's Araumi. He responds to this with an Arcane Denial, and in response to that, James activates Kwain. Everybody draws a card and gains a life, triggering James's Ominous Seas, giving it another foreshadow counter. Caps hints that he has an answer to the denial, but CJ talks him out of it.
I have no response to that.
Mana Tithe. Come on, Anthony. Mana Tithe, please.
I mean, I really don't want to use this now, is the thing.
Don't use it now. It's literally a fucking value.
What do you rather? Be
Either
honest.
Tribute Mage or Muldrifter. If we're being honest, and I don't even know if I'm getting anything out of my graveyard. I have bigger creatures in my hand.
Okay. Alright.
Arcane Denial then resolves, and CJ starts his turn. On his upkeep, Arcane Denial's delayed trigger resolves, CJ draws 1 card, and James draws 2, putting 2 more counters on the Ominous Seas, finally reaching the long-anticipated 8 counters. James immediately removes the 8 counters to create an 8/8 Kraken token, and frankly, who could blame him? The Kraken will be represented by this Umaro card from the Final Fantasy TCG. CJ plays a Misty Rainforest as his land for the turn, activating it right away, paying 1 life, grabbing an island from his library and putting it onto the battlefield. He activates Araumi, exiling a Misty Rainforest, a Marsh Flats, and an island to give the Muldrifter in his yard Encore. He then Encores Muldrifter using Milliken to do so, milling 1 and getting 3 Muldrifter tokens out onto the battlefield. Upon entering, he draws 6 cards.
Bro, that's fine. That's right.
It has fun.
What the H?
Dude, I'm gonna take 2 damage. Fuck.
He then casts a Cloud of Fairies, untapping 2 lands when it enters the battlefield, then heads into combat. He swings 1 Muldrifter per opponent. James and Caps can't block, so they take 2 damage each, and I block with Halana and Alena's Hidden Reach mode, killing the Muldrifter on first strike damage. In his post-combat main phase, CJ casts a Victimize, sacrificing 1 of the Muldrifters to bring back Sower of Discord and Tribute Mage from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Tribute Mage and Sower of Discord trigger when they enter the battlefield. He chooses James and I as the players for the Sower, and finds a Sundial of the Infinite with the Mage, putting it into his hand and passing the turn. James draws for the turn, triggering Ominous Seas, putting a counter on it. Then he plays an island as his land for the turn, following it up with a Soul Warden, then passing the turn. Caps plays a forest, then casts Hamza, Guardian of Arashin, from the command zone, cost reduced by 1. This triggers Karametra on cast, so Caps searches for a forest, which enters his battlefield tapped. He shortcuts and finds a plains while he's at it, because right after this, he casts an Armorcraft Judge, which would trigger Karametra again. As Hamza and the Judge enter the battlefield, they both trigger Soul Warden, gaining James 2 life. The Judge also has its own trigger, drawing Caps 1 card. Having nothing else, he passes the turn to me. I start off with a Rockfall Veil, triggering the retreat to Kazandu. I choose to put a 1/1 counter on Halana and Alena again. Then I cast a Lifecrafter's Bestiary, following that up with a Heronbleed Elite, triggering the Bestiary, which I pay a green for to draw a card. James gains 1 life from a Soul Warden trigger, and I enter combat. Then Halana and Alena trigger, and I put 4 1/1 counters onto Heronblade Elite, which CJ tries to counter with a keyboard to the table, but he doesn't have the mana to cast it, so it returns to his hand. I swing the Heronblade Elite at CJ, who does not block and takes 5 damage. In my post-combat main phase, I tap the Elite for 5 red mana, and Rishkar for 1 green in order to play Arnie Slays the Troll, floating 4 red. In response, CJ casts a Fierce Guardianship for free since he controls his commander, countering the spell. But in response to this, James casts a Fact or Fiction, revealing 3 lands, a Swiftfoot Boots, and a Heliod Sun Crowned. James knows I've had his back for nearly 2 decades now, so he chooses me to pick the piles.
How many cards you got in your hand?
Like 7.
Bro, guess what? You're about to have 12. 5-0, baby.
Yeah, 5-0. Here we go.
James puts all the cards in the 5 pile into his hand, and with the Guardianship still on the stack, activates Kwain. Everyone draws a card, triggering the Ominous Seas, and we all gain 1 life. With that resolved, James passes priority, as does Caps, and I cast an Inscription of Abundance. I pick the 3rd option on the inscription, having my Ape token fight Araumi, sending it back to the command zone. The Fierce Guardianship then resolves, and the Arnie Slays the Troll is countered.
Araumi is down. Am I no longer the threat, please?
Nope.
Never.
Because there's some guy with a lot of counters over there. There's 2 guys with a lot of counters and a lot bigger creatures.
I pass the turn over to the obvious threat. CJ starts with a Noxious Gearhulk, using the Milliken to help cast it, but missing the mill that comes with it. This triggers Soul Warden, and James gains 1 life. When the Gearhulk enters the battlefield, it also targets and destroys Halana and Alena, gaining CJ 5 life. CJ follows this up with a Sundial of the Infinite, and plays a Watery Grave as his land for the turn, paying the 2 life to have it come in untapped. He enters combat and swings Sower of Discord at James, who has no blocks and takes 6 damage. This also causes me to lose 6 life from Sower of Discord's triggered ability. He passes the turn, and on his end step, James activates the Epheto Alchemist to untap Kwain, then reactivate Kwain. Everybody draws a card and gains 1 life, which triggers the Ominous Seas. Then James goes to start his turn. James draws, again triggering the Ominous Seas, which at this point, let's just have a little indicator over in the corner with how many Foreshadow counters it has on it, and you can just expect that this will keep going while this is on the battlefield. He plays a Plains, then casts Sphinx of the Second Sun, triggering Soul Warden when it enters, gaining James a life. Now before he ends his turn, after his second main phase, he will get a second untap, upkeep, and draw. He activates Kwain here, and everybody opts to draw and gain a life. Then he untaps Kwain with a Epheto Alchemist, tapping him again, everybody drawing another 1 and gaining another 1. James passes through combat and starts his post-combat main phase, at which point the delay trigger from the Sphinx of the Second Sun goes onto the stack. So he moves through his second main, untaps, upkeeps, and draws as that trigger resolves, then ends his turn, passing it over to Caps, and on cleanup discarding 4 lands, Savin's Reclamation, Windfall, Storm of Souls, and Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. Caps plays a Forest as his land for the turn, then casts an Unbounded Potential, Entwined, putting a +1/+1 counter each on Hamza and Armorcraft Judge, then proliferates, putting an additional 1/1 counter on each of his creatures. He follows this up with an Esper Sentinel, triggering his Karametra, so he grabs a Forest for his battlefield. Then when the Sentinel enters, James gains 1 life from Soul Warden. Caps casts a Fertilid next, again triggering Karametra, and then Soul Warden, gaining James a life, and Caps grabs a Plains for the battlefield. Fertilid enters with 2 +1/+1 counters, putting Caps at 4 creatures with counters, reducing the cost of his creature spells by 4 total thanks to Hamza's ability. Spending 0 mana thanks to this cost reduction, he casts an Ugin's Conjurant for an X of 4, which enters with 4+1/+1 counters, and this again triggers both Karametra and then Soul Warden, gaining James another life after Caps grabs a forest from his library to the battlefield. Caps enters combat and swings Hamza at CJ and Genesis Hydra at me. I can't block and take 3, while CJ triple blocks with Noxious Gearhulk, Stitcher Supplier, and Cloud of Fairies. Before damage, Caps casts an Inspiring Call, drawing 5 cards and giving all of his creatures with counters on them indestructible. All of CJ's blockers die and Stitcher Supplier triggers, at which point CJ mills 2 swamps and a Grey Merchant of Asphodel when it dies. Caps passes, discarding a forest and a Garruk. I untap, and on my upkeep, Lifecrafter's Bestiary triggers, so I scry 1, keeping it on top, and then draw it for the turn. I pass through my first main phase to enter combat and swing my 6/6 Gibbon token at Caps, who double blocks it with Armorcraft Judge and Ugin's Conjurant. I assign 5 damage to the Judge, which kills it, and then the remaining 1 damage is dealt to the Conjurant, taking one of its +1/+1 counters away. I then tap all of my creatures for mana, using 5 red from the Heronblade Elite to cast Chain Reaction, paying for the Esper Sentinel trigger, keeping the other 2 green mana floating. In response to this, James activates Kwain twice thanks to the Epheto Alchemist untapping it for the second activation, and everyone draws 2 and gains 2 life. With no other responses, everything dies. I then recast my commander, triggering the Lifecrafter's Bestiary, so I pay 1 green into that to draw, and on the stack, CJ responds to the cast.
You know, it's definitely cool with the board wave. I want to be the first one to have a board.
So you're going to counter my commander.
Yes, the worst.
Well, then I'm going to annihilate you.
He casts Counterspell, countering Halana and Alena. I, however, still do not intend to let CJ be back on the board first, so I cast Incubation Druid. I do in a blind rage, however, make a rules mistake here though, because I play a forest after the Druid has entered the battlefield to use Retreat to Kazandu to put a +1/+1 counter on the Druid, but somehow also use this land to pay for the Bestiary trigger that would have already passed. So in any other game where a bespectacled rabbit wasn't force-feeding the entire table their whole fucking decks to begin with, this may have been more than a problem, but honestly either way, it was a mistake. I passed to Public Enemy number 1. CJ starts by recasting Araumi from his command zone.
I don't think we're going to get to do much this turn, unfortunately.
Good.
Very good.
I underestimated my ability to do things.
He plays and equips a Swiftfoot Boots and sorrowfully passes the turn to James. On the end step, James removes 8 Foreshadow counters from Ominous Seas to make a Kraken token, then starts his turn. He plays a Mystic Sanctuary, which comes in untapped, so James is able to put Storm of Souls on top of his library with the ETB trigger. He recasts Kwain Itinerant Meddler from the command zone and follows it up with a Swiftfoot Boots, activation of Swiftfoot Boots, and a Triskaidekaphile, all of which reveals my complicated relationship with the state of this game.
Flashback.
This game is never going to end.
No, my bad.
It will never end.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
Well,
That's a win con.
Which is, yeah, I'm trying to do that.
time to kill that.
James enters combat and swings the Kraken token at Caps, who has no blocks and takes 8 damage. James passes the turn. Caps starts off turn 9 with his own Lifecrafter's Bestiary, and then casts 2019 Standard Sideboard All-Star Vivian Reed. He activates her -3 ability right away, targeting CJ's Sundial of the Infinite, destroying it as the ability resolves. Sigarda, Host of Herons, then enters the chat, which triggers both Karametra and Caps' Lifecrafter's Bestiary. He pays a green to draw a card, then finds another basic from his library, passing the turn as he searches.
Alright, I'll fucking untap, I'll scree 1.
I keep the card I scried on top and draw it. I cast an 8 mana Halana and Alena from the command zone, then play my land for the turn, triggering the Retreat to Kazandu, and I opt to put a +1/+1 counter on Halana and Alena. I proceed to cast a Werewolf Pack Leader, which triggers my Lifecrafter's Bestiary. I pay a green mana into the trigger and draw a card. I then enter combat and Halana and Alena trigger. I put 3/1/1 counters onto the Werewolf Pack Leader, then give it haste, making it large enough to satisfy its own Pack Tactics trigger solo, and swing it at CJ, drawing a card. CJ has no blocks, taking 6 damage. At end of turn, I discard Mindless Automaton to hand size. CJ starts off by activating Araumi, exiling 3 cards from his graveyard to give Cloud of Fairies Encore. He taps 6 mana, 2 blue and 4 black, floating the black mana as he encores the Cloud of Fairies, then untapping all 6 of those lands as the token copies enter the battlefield. With the 4 black floating, he casts a Dread Return, targeting and returning the Noxious Gearhulk as the spell resolves. Noxious Gearhulk targets the Werewolf Pack Leader with its ETB, destroying that and gaining CJ6 life. He then sacrifices the 3 Cloud of Fairies tokens to the flashback cost of Dread Return, targeting and returning Grey Merchant of Asphodel to the battlefield from his graveyard. The rest of the table gets drained for 5 life each, and CJ gains 15 life as the enters the battlefield trigger resolves. Now at a hearty 57 life, he passes the turn to James, who on the end step activates Kwain, and the table draws 1 and gains 1, except for CJ, because he missed the trigger and that's what you get. James then untaps and activates Kwain again, the absolute madman. We all draw 1 card and gain 1 life. James casts a Storm of Souls, returning a Pheto Alchemist, Soul Warden, and Sphinx of the Second Sun from his graveyard to the battlefield as 1/1 flying spirits in addition to their other types. When they all enter, Soul Warden triggers, seeing the other 2 creatures, gaining James 2 more life. He then plays a land, equips the booties onto a Pheto Alchemist, and taps it to untap Kwain, and activates that silly little rabbit again, so we all draw 1 and gain 1. He passes through combat and the second main phase, getting another beginning phase thanks to the Sphinx. He untaps, upkeeps with a mere 10 cards in hand, insufficient to even put the Triskaidekaphile trigger onto the stack, then draws and ends the turn. Cap starts off by missing his Bestiary Scry trigger, proceeding through to his draw step into first main to play a Forest for the turn. He activates Vivian Reed's +1 ability, revealing a Scavenging Ooze from amongst the top 4 cards of his library, and puts that goober into his hand. He then casts a Conclave Mentor, triggering his Karametra on cast, followed by James's Soul Warden once it enters. Caps finds a basic for the battlefield, and James gains a life. He then casts the Scavenging Ooze, again triggering Karametra and the Soul Warden. Same shit, different ooze. Caps activates the Ooze's ability right away to exile CJ's Puppeteer Click from his graveyard, gaining Caps a life, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters onto the Ooze with the extra counter coming from that Conclave Mentor. He follows this up by casting Renata, called to the hunt, and Vigor, triggering Karametra twice, then Soul Warden twice. You know how it goes. Vigor enters with 2 +1/+1 counters thanks to Renata and Conclave Mentor. With nothing else, he passes it over to me. I do Bestiary Scry, and I draw the card on top of my library. Then a Forest for the turn is played, triggering the retreat to Kazandu, so I put a +1/+1 counter on Halana and Alena, then cast a Rhythm of the Wild. I follow this up with an uncounterable Clouth Unrivaled Ancient, which now has Riot thanks to the Rhythm of the Wild. I put a +1/+1 counter on Clouth, then enter combat, triggering Halana and Alena. I put another 4 1/1 counters on Clouth and swing that sucker at Caps. On attack, I add 9 mana from Clouth's trigger, and Caps responds to the attack with a Path to Exile, targeting Clouth. It gets exiled, and I find a mountain for the battlefield.
Really wanted to swing that at CJ, but
No, please. No, I want him. We need him.
Yeah, I got the answer to
Him
James.
to get rid of the Triskaidekaphile, dude. Yeah.
It's not getting
We don't
rid of
wanna end the game or
Triskaidekaphile, but
anything.
it's a fun way to
No,
pick
man.
the Triskaidekaphile.
With the 9 mana floating, I play a Strionic Resonator followed by a Balaged Recovery, bringing Umezawa's Jite back from my graveyard to my hand. I then play the Jite and equip it onto Halana and Alena, spending the last of my floating mana to do so. I go to end my turn, and in response, CJ plays a Factor Fiction, targeting James to choose his piles. CJ reveals 2 lands, Thirst for Knowledge, Toxic Deluge, and a Fleshbag Marauder. James puts Toxic Deluge in a pile alone and the rest in the other pile. CJ puts the Deluge in his hand and then casts Forbidden Alchemy, putting a card from the top 4 into his hand and the others into his graveyard, bidding 2 lands and a Baleful Strix in this case. He passes priority, and James activates Kwain twice thanks to the Pheto Alchemist. We all draw 2 and gain 2, putting James at that critical 13 cards in hand. CJ then starts his turn. He plays a Swamp, then asks this question.
Alright. How many cards do you have in your library, James?
That's funny.
make us make.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. No, I can do it even if I wanted to.
Okay, I'm not counting that.
Political discussion then occurs regarding needing to cast the Toxic Deluge, and Caps, this guy literally moaned at least this loud.
I don't like that at all.
Literally.
I don't like the mana. Is it literally Deluge?
That'd be so disappointing.
It's so disappointing. I don't want to leave a fucking mana.
CJ plays an Altar of Dementia, then casts the Toxic Deluge, paying 20 fucking life into it. Why not? Putting him directly at starting life total and wiping the board of all creatures. Before it resolves though, James activates the Triskaidekaphile twice to draw 2 more cards, then passing priority afterwards. I cast an Inspiring Call to draw 2 cards myself, and the Deluge resolves. After this, and don't mind CJ's creatures still being on the board for now, he'll fix this later, he casts an Ashiok Dream Render, activating the -1 ability right away to mill James for 4 cards, then exile all cards from his opponent's graveyards. With nothing else, he passes the turn, discarding down to hand size. On his end step, James makes another Kraken token, then begins his turn. James casts a Tempsis All-Seeing and equips it up with the goddamn Swiftfoot booties after it resolves. He enters combat and swings a Tempsis at CJ, who has no blocks. He takes 4 damage and a Tempsis triggers. James reveals his 1 billion card hand and somehow has 6 different mana costs in there, issuing CJ 1 immediate game loss. Sweet, sweet revenge.
I think I do almost win next turn.
You
There's
lost.
definitely a way. No,
Yeah, but you fucking lost.
Caps and I note that Fumigate is in James's hand, and in his second main, James casts a Heliod Sun Crowned. He passes the turn, discarding a bunch of cards down to hand size. Caps, missing his Bestiary Scry again, casts a Ravenous Slime, followed by a Slurk, all ingesting, which enters with 5+1/+1 counters. Colossal Majesty gets cast next, and then Caps activates Vivian's -3, targeting and destroying James's Swiftfoot boots, and killing Vivian in the process.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Thinks with no shoes.
He doesn't know what to do.
The delirium of a 2-hour game was starting to get to us. Caps plays a Plains for his turn, then casts Micaeus the Lunarch with X=4, putting 4+1/+1 counters on him as he enters the battlefield. With nothing else, he passes the turn. I start off with my Bestiary Scry, put it on the bottom, then draw for the turn. I play a Walking Ballista for 6 mana, meaning it enters with 3 counters on its own, and I put another counter on it when it hits the field courtesy of Rhythm of the Wild. I play my land for the turn, giving the Ballista another 1/1 counter off of the Retreat to Kazandu, which I copy with the Strionic Resonator for another 1/1 counter, putting it at 6 total. I equip the Umezawa's Jite to the Ooze, then cast a Duskshell Crawler, and guess what? Put another counter on that fucking Ballista, which now has Trample thanks to the Crawler. I pass to James. James plays a Command Tower as his land for the turn, then casts a Late for Dinner, targeting Drogskull Reaver in his graveyard, his favorite card in the whole deck. This resolves, bringing the Reaver back, and James gets a food token as well. He casts a Lightning Greaves, and after it resolves, equips them onto the Drogskull Reaver. He then eats his food to gain 3 life, drawing a card from the Reaver's trigger. This also triggers Heliod, so James goes to put the counter on Drogskull Reaver, at which point we politely and respectfully remind him that this is not possible.
Where you putting that counter?
Attempts.
Where's your ballista?
It's
dude?
got Shroud. Get fucked.
So he instead targets a Tempsis, which gets sniped by the Walking Ballista with me removing 5 counters to kill that Shoeless Sphinx. We miss this until later, but this then triggers Ravenous Slime, exiling a Tempsis after he dies and putting 4+1/+1 counters onto the slime. James enters combat and swings the Reaver at me, gaining James 3 life twice, total of 6, drawing him a card on each damage step, first strike and, I guess, second strike, and also putting a +1/+1 counter on the Kraken token each time this happens thanks to Heliod.
So how many counters does your Ominous Seas have? Like, why is there no Krakens?
That is a
There's
Kraken.
one Kraken, dude.
There's one Kraken? How many other counters you got? I feel like you've drawn
I
so
think
much
you
more.
would-
feel like
You've killed them all, CJ.
Yeah, every Kraken has died.
James plays an Azorius Signet in his second main and passes it over to Caps. Caps finally Bestiary Scries on upkeep, bottoming it, drawing for his Colossal Majesty trigger, and then drawing for the turn. He untaps his giant fucking piles of basic lands and casts an absolutely necessary Mirari's Wake, doubling up his land-based mana. He then casts Evolution Sage, and it's at this point he remembers the Ravenous Slime trigger for exiling a Tempsis. On cast of the Evolution Sage, Lifecrafter's Bestiary triggers, and he pays the green mana to draw a card. He casts Loyal Guardian, again drawing thanks to the Lifecrafter's Bestiary, and then he activates Micaeus the Lunarch, taking a +1/+1 counter off of Micaeus to put a +1/+1 counter on everyone else that he controls. He follows this up with a Kodama's Reach, grabbing a land for the field and a land for hand. The first land triggers his Evolution Sage, allowing him to proliferate. James and I lobby for some handouts, but Caps selfishly only proliferates his own creatures. He then plays his land for the turn, proliferates again. Hamza, Guardian of Arashin, comes back out of the command zone, and Caps enters combat, triggering the Loyal Guardian. He puts a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures, and swings Ravenous Slime and Slurk at me. I have no blocks and take 20 damage. After this, the turn passes over to me. I scry from my Bestiary trigger, then draw for the turn. I cast a Glorious Sunrise, then play a Mosswort Bridge as my land for the turn. This triggers Retreat to Kazandu, so I put a +1/+1 counter on Walking Ballista. Hideaway from the Mosswort Bridge also triggers, and I slip a mystery card under there. I go to combat, at which point Glorious Sunrise triggers, so I choose to draw a card, then pass through combat. I cast a Cultivator of Blades in my second main phase, making 2 servo tokens when it enters the battlefield, then put a +1/+1 counter on it thanks to Rhythm of the Wild. I pass to James. He starts off by casting that Fumigate from earlier. So in response, Caps plays a Join Shields, potentially giving all of his creatures hexproof and indestructible. And in response to this, I take the last 3 1/1 counters off of my Ballista to deal 3 damage to Caps' face. I pass priority, and James casts a Heliod's Intervention with X equals 5, targeting Mirari's Wake, Colossal Majesty, both Lifecrafter's Bestiaries, and Glorious Sunrise. With no responses, the Heliod's Intervention resolves, destroying all targets. Then Join Shields resolves, making Caps' board hexproof and indestructible. Then Fumigate resolves, destroying the destructible portion of the battlefield and gaining James 6 life. Everything that died to Fumigate got exiled with Ravenous Slime, and Caps puts 16 +1/+1 counters onto it. James passes the turn. Caps plays a Command Tower, which triggers Evolution Sage to proliferate, putting another 1/1 counter on all of his creatures. He then casts a Pride Malkin, which has a trigger upon ETB, so Caps puts the 1/1 counter onto Hamza. He enters combat right after that, and Loyal Guardian triggers, putting another 1/1 counter on all of his certified big boys. He contemplates his attacks.
Hit me for 14, bro.
Hit him. Hit him.
You got that blink off.
No, I don't. Come on, what are you talking about?
Oh, she'll let
Much
the
mana do you actually
wasteland
have?
open, bro.
Everything also has trample, so you only have to hit him with 15 if you're concerned about the blink moth.
Yeah, that's true.
And he swings Loyal Guardian and Evolution Sage at me, and Mikaeus, Slurk, Ravenous Slime, and Hamza at James. I use the Blink Moth Nexus to activate itself. Then, once it's tapped, and with the activation on the stack, I use my untapped mountain to activate it again. I declare no blocks, fucking dying. James also has no blocks and takes 54 damage, going to 13. Feeling good about his position, Caps passes the turn to James.
Crack back.
Just get ready, bitch. No fucking way. I drew a board one.
You have to. You fucking have to.
No, I can't. I'm not.
Max
doing
punish.
it.
Yo, how could you not right now, dude?
I can't do it. I cannot do it.
There's no world in which you can't do it right now.
Bro, that was not okay.
Take your shields down, make him have it.
Yeah.
He's got so much open mana.
James casts this miraculous Supreme Verdict for the integrity of the YouTube content, and Caps has no response, destroying all his big, juicy, thick, dumperific boys. James casts a Dream Trawler and then tims him up, swings the Bing, drawing from the attack trigger to make the Trawler a 5/5. Caps takes 5 and James gains 5 from the lifelink. He mistakenly puts a 1/1 counter on Dream Trawler from Heliod, which he couldn't have done due to Shroud, but we forget to politely remind him this time, so oopsies. In his post-combat main phase, James takes 8 counters off of Ominous Seas to create a Kraken, and then he casts a Chasm Skulker and passes to Caps. Caps draws and recasts Hamza for the actual 14th time of this game, and he follows that up with a Jiang Yanggu Wild Crafter, activating it immediately to put a +1/+1 counter onto Hamza. With nothing else to do, he passes the turn. James draws for the turn, triggering Ominous Seas to get a whatever counter on it. The Chasm Skulker gets a 1/1 counter, and then Dream Trawler gets +1/+0 until the end of the turn. James casts Shabraz, the Sky Shark, which has a partner with trigger, so he forces Caps to shuffle his library. A legal play. Look it up. He puts Lightning Greaves on Shabraz and enters combat. He swings out at Caps, getting a draw from the Dream Trawler, triggering it for another +1/+0, also triggering Chasm Skulker and Shabraz, putting a +1/+1 counter onto each of them and gaining 1 life off of the Shabraz, which triggers Heliod, putting another 1/1 counter on Dream Trawler. In response to the attack, Caps casts a Dawn Charm, choosing to prevent all combat damage this turn.
Bro, I hate this. I hate being in this position. But I'm winning this
11?
game. I'm sorry.
In response to the Dawn Charm, James casts a Rapid Hybridization, targeting Hamza. In response to this, Caps casts a Feat of Resistance to put a +1/+1 counter on Hamza and give it protection from blue. But in response to that, James casts a Generous Gift, again targeting Hamza. Hamza gets destroyed and becomes a significantly less relevant elephant. James passes the turn over to Caps. Caps draws and shows off an ever-flowing chalice, and with it as his only card in hand, admits defeat, conceding the game to James. Bro, absolutely insane game, stacked with board wipes, responses, banter, good times with friends, and just good vibes. This was one of the longest games we've ever had, and it was a great time start to finish. From CJ scheming on something he literally couldn't even do because he counted wrong, to Caps managing to rebuild a massive board 3 times in a row, to me tooling around with Blink Moth Nexus for memes, James buying multiple pairs of shoes for multiple Sphinxes. This game was an absolute blast, start to finish, and these are the games that remind me how I wouldn't give up playing Magic with my friends for anything. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you liked the content. You're sexy, you're amazing. Thanks for watching.